The first night I moved into that apartment, I heard glass shatter against a wall at 2 in the morning, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. I stood frozen in the hallway with a box of kitchen plates in my arms, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe kindness can crack open even the hardest hearts, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning. My name is Daniel, and 3 years ago I was 26 years old, broke, freshly out of a relationship that had left me hollow, and desperate enough to answer a roommate ad that every sane person in the city had apparently already rejected. The listing was blunt in a way that should have scared me off. Room for rent. Cheap. I keep to myself. Don't expect friendship. I remember laughing when I read it, thinking whoever wrote it had a strange sense of humor. I didn't know yet that it wasn't a joke at all. It was a warning. The apartment was in an old brick building on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with creaky radiators and windows that never quite closed all the way. When I arrived for the walkthrough, the man who opened the door didn't smile, didn't offer his hand, didn't even fully step aside to let me in. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a stray animal that wandered onto your porch, uncertain whether to shoo it away or ignore it until it left on its own. His name was Marcus. He was maybe 30, tall, with dark circles under his eyes and a stillness about him that felt less like calm and more like exhaustion carried for so long it had become a personality. I told him I'd take the room before he even finished the tour, mostly because I couldn't afford to be picky, but also because something about the emptiness in his eyes tugged at a part of me I didn't fully understand yet. He shrugged and said, "Your funeral," and walked away without another word. I thought he was joking. I was wrong about that too. The first few weeks were an education in silence. Marcus left for work before I woke up and came home after I'd usually given up waiting to see him. When our paths did cross in the kitchen or the narrow hallway, he offered nothing more than a nod, sometimes not even that. I tried in the beginning the way most people try. I'd say good morning. I'd ask about his day. I'd knock softly on his door if I was ordering food and ask if he wanted anything. Every attempt was met with the same flat wall, a short reply or none at all, until I started to feel foolish for even trying. It was on a Tuesday night about a month in when I found him sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, an empty bottle beside him and his phone cracked in his hand like he'd thrown it and regretted it immediately after. I didn't say anything clever. I just sat down across from him, on the cold tile, and waited. He looked at me like I was an intrusion he didn't have the energy to fight off, and then he said the words that would end up changing both of our lives, though neither of us knew it yet. He said, "Nobody can stand me. Not my family, not my friends, not the last 3 people who've lived in this apartment. So do us both a favor and don't waste your time." I remember the exact weight of that silence afterward, how it pressed down on the room like something physical. I could have agreed with him. I could have nodded, gone back to my room and let him keep the walls he'd clearly spent years building. It would have been easier. But something in me, maybe stubbornness, maybe some old wound of my own that recognized his, made me say instead, "Maybe you just hadn't met me yet." He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was sharp and bitter, the kind of sound people make when they've heard promises before and watched every single one of them break. He told me I didn't know him, that I'd only been living there a few weeks, that people like me always said things like that and always left eventually, just like everyone else had. I didn't argue with him that night. I just stayed on that cold kitchen floor until he fell asleep sitting up, and then I got a blanket from my room and put it over his shoulders before going to bed myself. Looking back now, I understand that this wasn't some fairy tale where kindness magically fixes a person overnight. What followed was months of trial, of setbacks, of moments where I genuinely questioned whether I was wasting my life trying to reach someone who seemed determined to stay unreachable. Marcus had a temper that could flare without warning, snapping over dishes left in the sink or music played too loud through the wall. He had days where he wouldn't speak at all, where he'd disappear into his room for what felt like entire lifetimes, emerging only to grab food and vanish again. There were nights I'd hear him pacing, muttering to himself, and I'd lie awake wondering what battles were happening on the other side of that wall that I couldn't see and couldn't fix. I started noticing the patterns, though. the way you notice weather changing if you pay close enough attention. Marcus got quieter, more volatile. In the days after he'd call his mother, calls I could sometimes hear through the thin walls, though never the words, only the tone. Tight and defensive, like a man bracing for impact before it even arrived. I learned, slowly and through fragments he let slip in unguarded moments, that his father had left when he was young, that his mother had cycled through boyfriends who treated Marcus as an inconvenience at best, that he had spent so much of his life being told, directly or through cruel silence, that he was too much and not enough at the same time. He had been abandoned so many times that he'd started abandoning himself first, before anyone else got the chance. I didn't have a grand plan. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important for anyone watching this who's trying to reach someone difficult in their own life. I didn't have some strategy for fixing Marcus. What I had was consistency, and I think consistency is its own kind of quiet miracle. I kept showing up. I kept saying good morning even when he didn't answer. I kept leaving a plate of food out on nights I knew he'd worked late, even when he never once thanked me for it. I kept sitting in the same room as him sometimes, not talking, just existing nearby, because I sensed that the silence itself was less lonely with someone else in it. There was a night, maybe 4 months into living together, when everything nearly fell apart. Marcus came home furious after being let go from his job. A job he'd hated but needed, and he tore through the apartment throwing things, screaming that everyone always left, that everyone always found a reason to get rid of him, that I would too eventually, so I might as well just say it now and save us both the trouble. I stood in the doorway of the living room watching a man come undone in front of me, and for one terrifying moment I genuinely didn't know if I was safe, or if this apartment, this fragile experiment in patience, was about to end violently and badly. I didn't run, I didn't yell back. I just stood there and told him, as steadily as I could manage with my heart hammering in my chest, that I wasn't going anywhere, that he could scream at me all night if he needed to, but I wasn't leaving, and I wasn't going to stop being his friend just because he was in pain. He broke down after that, not gently, not like in the movies. It was ugly and messy, the kind of crying that comes from years of pressure finally finding a crack. He sat on the floor again, like that first night, and I sat with him again, and this time he told me things he had clearly never said out loud to another living person. He told me about the year his father left without saying goodbye, just gone one morning with no note. He told me about a stepfather who used to call him a burden in front of guests, as some kind of joke that always landed like a blade. He told me he had learned very young that it was safer to push people away first, because at least then the leaving was his choice and not something done to him. I won't pretend that one night fixed everything, because that isn't how real healing works, and I think stories that pretend otherwise do a disservice to anyone actually living through something hard. What changed after that night was smaller and slower than a movie montage. Marcus started leaving his door open sometimes when he got home from work. He started asking, awkwardly at first, if I wanted to grab dinner instead of eating separately. He started laughing, really laughing, at something I said one evening while we were doing dishes, and I remember stopping mid-motion because I realized I had never actually heard him laugh before, not once in 5 months. There were still hard days. There was a stretch in the winter where he barely left his room for almost 2 weeks, and I later learned he had been battling depression that had gotten dangerously heavy, heavier than either of us had said out loud. I remember knocking on his door every single day during that stretch, not demanding he talk, just letting him know through the wood that I was still there, that dinner was on the stove if he wanted it, that I wasn't going anywhere no matter how long the silence lasted. I look back on those 2 weeks now as some of the most frightening of my life, because I genuinely did not know, some nights, whether he was okay on the other side of that door. I want to pause here and say gently to anyone watching who might be going through something similar, either as the person struggling or the person trying to help someone who is, please take those silences seriously. Please reach out for real support when things feel that heavy, because sometimes love and patience need backup, and there is no shame in that at all. Marcus eventually came out of that stretch, thinner, quieter, but alive, and something between us had shifted permanently by then. He started calling me his friend, not roommate, in conversations with other people, small moments that meant more to me than he probably realized. He got a new job, one he actually liked, working with his hands at a small woodworking shop across town. And he came home some nights with sawdust on his jeans and something like pride in his voice that I hadn't heard before. He started reconnecting tentatively and painfully with his mother, not to erase the past, but to try building something honest out of its wreckage. He told me once, almost embarrassed to say it out loud, that he had started seeing a therapist and that it was the hardest and most useful thing he had ever done for himself. I think about that first conversation often, the one where he told me nobody could stand him and I told him maybe he just hadn't met me yet. At the time it felt like a small act of stubbornness, almost a dare I made to myself as much as to him. I didn't know it would turn into the defining relationship of my adult life. The person who would stand beside me at my sister's wedding, the person who would sit with me in a hospital waiting room the night my father had his heart surgery. The person who, 3 years later, is no longer just my roommate, but the closest thing I have to a brother. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it's made you think about someone in your own life who might just be waiting for one person to stay long enough to prove they're not like everyone who left before, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that patience and kindness can still change a life. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who need to hear them most. Before I close this out, I want to ask you something directly. I want you to comment below, just one word or one sentence, about a person in your life who stayed when they didn't have to. Someone who saw past your walls the way I tried to see past Marcus's. I read every comment, and I think there is something powerful in naming the people who chose us when they didn't have to. Take a moment and write that name, even if only you and I will ever know who it is. Marcus still lives with me, though we've since moved to a bigger place with an extra room that's become his woodworking corner, filled with half-finished chairs and the smell of fresh-cut pine. He still has hard days. He probably always will, because healing isn't a straight line, and it isn't a finish line either. It's just a direction you keep choosing to walk in, one ordinary day at a time. But he laughs now, freely and often, and he calls his mother every Sunday, and he tells people without flinching that he has a good life. Without flinching that he has a good life. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is quiet the way it used to be in those early frightening months, I think about how close I came to giving up on him. How easy it would have been to let his warning push me away like it had pushed away everyone before me. I think about how many people in this world are walking around convinced that nobody can stand them, when really they just haven't met the person who's willing to stay. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. The people who seem hardest to love are often the ones who need it most desperately. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fix someone. It's simply to stay long enough for them to remember they're worth staying for. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it moved you even a little, let me know in the comments, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next story.